"Sir, I can make your daughter walk again," the beggar boy said, his voice steady despite the tattered clothes hanging off his thin frame. The millionaire, a man who had heard every pitch and promise, turned and froze, caught not by the words alone but by the unflinching certainty in the boy's eyes. In that moment, a spark of possibility pierced the weight of years spent chasing miracles for his child. The millionaire, Richard Hale, had built his fortune through real estate, turning barren lots into towering complexes that defined city skylines. His life was one of calculated risks and relentless ambition, but nothing had prepared him for the day his daughter, Emily, lost the ability to walk. She was 8 when the accident happened. A car crash on a rain-slicked road, the kind of tragedy that doesn't care about wealth or status. The doctors called it a spinal injury, severe but not hopeless, and Richard threw everything he had at it: specialists, experimental treatments, clinics across continents. Yet, 5 years later, Emily remained in her wheelchair, her spirit bright but her legs still. Richard's wealth could buy hope, but it couldn't buy miracles. The boy, named Samir, was 14, though he looked younger, his body worn by years on the streets of a city that chewed up those without means. He wasn't begging for coins when he approached Richard outside the hospital. He was there for something else. Richard had just left another consultation, the doctor's words echoing, "We've done all we can." He was tired, his suit rumpled from a sleepless night, when Samir stepped forward. The boy's clothes were patched, his shoes held together with tape, but his gaze was steady. "I know about your daughter," he said. "I can help her." Richard's first instinct was dismissal. He'd heard it all before: charlatans, faith healers, opportunists sniffing out his desperation. But something about Samir stopped him. Maybe it was the boy's refusal to look away, or the way he spoke without a trace of greed. Richard asked, "What do you mean, help her?" Samir didn't flinch. "I've seen things, learned things. I can make a machine to fix her spine. But I need your help to build it." Samir's story wasn't one he shared lightly. He'd grown up in a slum on the city's edge, where survival meant scavenging for scraps, food, clothes, knowledge. His mother had died when he was 6, his father a vague memory. Samir learned early that the world didn't give, you had to take. But he wasn't like the others who fought over scraps. He collected books, discarded manuals, broken electronics, anything that held the promise of understanding. By 10, he was fixing radios for neighbors. By 12, building circuits from salvaged parts. He taught himself from fragments of textbooks, piecing together physics and engineering the way a puzzle master works with missing pieces. The idea for the machine came from a chance encounter. A year earlier, Samir had found a discarded medical journal in a dumpster behind a clinic. It described neural stimulation, a technique to reawaken dormant nerves. The science was complex, but Samir's mind was a sponge. He read it cover to cover, then again, until the concepts took root. He began experimenting with wires and batteries, testing theories on small motors, dreaming of something bigger. When he heard about Emily Hale, not from gossip, but from a nurse who'd tossed out a case file he found, he saw a purpose. Her injury matched the problem he'd been trying to solve. Richard didn't believe Samir at first, but he listened. The boy spoke of electrodes, signal pathways, and muscle response with a clarity that belied his age and circumstances. Richard, no stranger to assessing potential, saw something in Samir's words, a logic that wasn't just hope but calculation. Still, he was cautious. "Why should I trust you?" he asked. Samir's answer was simple: "Because I've got nothing to lose, and you've got everything to gain." They met again the next day, this time in a cafe, where Richard could think without the hospital's sterile wait. Samir brought a notebook, pages filled with diagrams and notes in a meticulous hand. It wasn't polished, but it was precise, schematics for a device that could, in theory, stimulate Emily's nerves to relearn movement. Richard, who'd sat through countless presentations from PhDs, was stunned. The boy wasn't promising a cure, he was proposing a tool, one that would need months of work and resources he didn't have. "I can build it," Samir said, "but I need a lab, materials, and time." Richard took a risk, not because he fully believed, but because he couldn't afford not to. He set Samir up in a small workshop, a converted garage behind one of his properties. He provided tools, computers, and access to a network of suppliers. Samir didn't ask for money, only what he needed to work. Richard visited often, watching the boy turn scraps into something that looked like purpose. Emily, now 13, met Samir too. She didn't see a beggar. She saw someone who looked at her without pity, who talked about her legs like they were a problem to solve, not a tragedy to mourn. The machine took shape over months. Samir worked late, his hands steady as he soldered circuits and calibrated sensors. He explained his progress to Richard in terms Richard could understand. The device would send targeted electrical pulses to Emily's spine, bypassing damage to nerves to trigger muscle response. It wasn't a cure-all, it was a start. Emily would need to train her body to respond, a process that could take years. But Samir's confidence was infectious, and Emily, who'd grown quiet over the years, began to ask questions, to hope. The first test was small, just a prototype on Emily's calf. Richard watched, heart in his throat, as Samir attached electrodes and powered the device. A twitch, barely noticeable, ran through Emily's leg. She gasped, not in pain but in surprise. Richard's eyes met Samir's, and for the first time in years, he felt something like faith. The boy didn't smile, he just nodded and went back to work. Setbacks followed. The prototype overheated, the signals were inconsistent, and Emily tired quickly. Samir didn't waver. He adjusted, rebuilt, tested again. Richard brought in a neurologist, Dr. Patel, who'd been skeptical but grew intrigued by Samir's work. She offered guidance, refining the device's parameters, but Samir was the one who made it real. He worked with a focus that shut out the world, as if the machine was an extension of himself. Emily's progress was slow but measurable. By the 6th month, she could flex her foot. By the 9th, she could stand with support for a few seconds. Each step forward was a battle, won through sweat and stubbornness. Richard watched his daughter fight, not just with her body but with her spirit, and he saw the girl she'd been before the accident, fierce, unbroken. Samir was there for every session, adjusting the machine, explaining each tweak to Emily like she was a partner, not a patient. The city began to notice. Whispers spread about the millionaire and the beggar boy, about a machine that defied medical wisdom. Richard shielded Samir from the attention, knowing how quickly hope could turn to pressure. He hired tutors to fill the gaps in Samir's education, not out of charity, but because he saw potential that went beyond the machine. Samir absorbed it all, math, physics, biology, while still working on the device. A year after that first meeting, Emily took her first step. It was shaky, supported by parallel bars and Samir's steady voice, but it was real. Richard stood frozen, just as he had when Samir first spoke to him. This time it wasn't shock but awe. Emily laughed, a sound Richard hadn't heard in years, and Samir, for the first time, smiled. The machine wasn't a miracle. It was a beginning. Emily's recovery would take years, maybe a lifetime, but the path was clear. Samir's device drew interest from hospitals, researchers, even companies. Richard made sure Samir's name was on every patent, every paper. The boy who'd once scavenged for scraps was now a name in medical journals, though he never seemed to care about the fame. Samir stayed with Richard's family, not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. He kept working, not just on Emily's machine but on others, ideas that could help people he'd never meet. Richard, who'd spent his life building empires, found himself learning from a boy who'd started with nothing. The title of the story, the one that began with a beggar boy's bold claim, wasn't about wealth or status. It was about what happens when someone sees a problem, believes they can solve it, and refuses to let the world tell them otherwise. Years later, Emily walked into a room where Samir was presenting his work to a group of doctors. She didn't use a wheelchair, though she leaned on a cane. Richard watched from the back, his heart full. Samir, now a young man, spoke with the same steady voice he'd had as a boy. The doctors listened, not because of his past but because of what he'd done. The title he'd earned wasn't one anyone could give. It was one he'd built, piece by piece, from the scraps of a world that had tried to forget him.